Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to KojiCon 2024, Presence, Place, Possibility. My name is Eric Dawson, and I'm an educator and farmer here for the Yellow Farmhouse Education Center. We're a small nonprofit based in southeastern Connecticut, and our mission is to connect people with each other and to where their food comes from through culinary and farm-based education. So KojiCon 2024 would not be possible without the support of our sponsors, specifically our cultivator sponsor, Hako Lab. So today we have a really cool presentation titled Koji Know-How in the Age of Capitalist Extraction. And we're going to be joined by Dr. Maya Hay. So Dr. Maya Hay is a researcher at the Center for Social Study of Microbes in Helsinki, Finland. She studies fermentation as a way to theorize how humans and microbes can continue living together without our narrative falling into a zero-sum trap. In her latest work, she calls upon feminists and non-Western thought to focus on ferments and microbiomes. Her work experience spans chemistry labs, culinary kitchens, organic farms, and food markets, where she has cumulatively garnered over 15 years of experience facilitating discussions around contemporary food and health issues. She also holds a degree in dietetics, food studies, and communications. So with that, I would like to welcome Maya Hay to the stream.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'm so happy that you're joining with me. Wherever you are, it might be morning for you, might be midday, or might be evening, or you might be rewatching this. But all the same, I'm very happy that you're here. So Eric, I might already start with some slides, if that's all right with you.
Perfect.
Great. I will do that. And here we go. So beginning, that might be a good place to start. Here we are. So today I'm going to be talking about Koji Know-How.
Sorry, can you just share in your screen one more time?
Sure.
Yeah.
Always technical difficulties when it comes to slides, no?
It wouldn't be KojiCon without them.
This is true. How's that?
It's perfect. Yep, now we're in full screen.
Woo, excellent. Fantastic. So let's start that over. Today I'm going to be talking about Koji Know-How, particularly in the context of capitalism, which, always a fun topic, but I'm hoping that this community of Koji experts and Koji enthusiasts can really come together and really ask the difficult questions. So what do I mean by Koji Know-How? Koji Know-How for me is about everything that entails knowing how to work with something, in this case, Koji, right? And so it's a form of a practical skill. It's a practice-based skill that then becomes embodied as a form of expertise. And so really this talk is really about who gets to count as an expert and who gets to train to be an expert in these Koji communities here and elsewhere, especially as the hype and the hope and the promise and the excitement around Koji continues to develop. And because that hype and that promise is there, it's warranted. Koji has so many opportunities and so many possibilities, right? So as you're listening to this talk, think about who gets to be called an expert, who gets to be a part of a community, and what are the possibilities and the relationships that we want to have as a result of this group of experts. So the possibilities of Koji, right? For those of you, for most of you probably in this audience, this is probably straightforward in the sense that Koji possibility comes from its enzymatic potential. Enzymes such as amylases, proteases, lipases, these are all part of Aspergillus oryzae as well as many other fungal ferments, right? And if you would like a refresher course, this was the talk that I gave last year. Here is the slides for it. You can kind of guide yourself through those slides. I kind of give an overview of both the possibilities that enzymes can offer, but also some of the potential pitfalls of only relying on enzymes and not the bigger context. So certainly a world of possibilities, but also some pitfalls to kind of keep in mind. We also know that Koji offers a world of possibilities through East Asian cuisine. For instance, in Japanese cuisine, a lot of the condiments, right? If we think of like sake, shoyu, miso, meaning these are all coming from Koji and Koji derivatives, right? And even beyond that, we can see these condiments be added to more koji, like shio koji and shoyu koji, in order to have more possibilities for preserving and transforming foods. We even see koji being used as a pickling device in something like sagohachi or even bettarazuke, right? And so while that is perhaps a cuisine that's codified in East Asia, we also see use cases outside now, right? Because of this possibilities that just go beyond the level of condiments. And we can see, for instance, this guy, who is no stranger to this community, around using koji as a way to mimic dry aging, right? Using those proteases in a very different context than what was historically used, right? And that these then practices outside of East Asian contexts and East Asian cultures, we even see a redefinition of what cuisine is even like. So here I'm looking at the examples of so-called new Nordic cuisine or newer Nordic cuisine, right? That have taken the idea of miso and then localized the substrate in a way that really focuses on peas and rye, what is actually available in that locale, as opposed to importing soybeans, right, or from elsewhere. And so I mention all of this. I mean, this is probably nothing new to this audience, but the allure of koji and its possibilities are really gaining traction outside of this community too. And so I want you to think about who is not here at KojiCon and who else might still be working with koji. And I'm giving you an example from, this hot sauce producer with whom Eleni Michael, who I'm working with, shout out to her if you're in the audience. We're working on a paper that looks at koji usage outside of its sort of historical or cultural context. And in conversation with these producers, we hear ideas or sentiments such as this. This is a quote from an interview with them that Eleni conducted. Quote, "The same recipe without koji has a very, very different flavor profile. The possibilities of explorations you can end up with, the way you can transform things. I was speaking to a friend who worked at Noma, and it seems that koji unlocks a whole new world of possibilities." Right? And so this idea of possibilities, right, is expanding beyond the place of Japan, beyond the place of East Asia, beyond the place of even this particular community, right, that spans a global reach. These questions of possibilities are now all over the place in other communities as well. And so with this possibility, I implore you to look at also the other questions that are actually a bit more political. And what I mean by political here is not politics of governments and geopolitics, which maybe also could be a part of it, but I mean like lowercase p politics, right? Who can know? Who is allowed to know? Who is allowed to transfer this knowledge from one person to another? Who's allowed to make commodities for sale, and who gains as a result, right? These are all very sticky questions, especially in the context of capitalism, when resource accumulation is really allowed and really is kept to a select few, right? And so when only a select few can benefit from capitalism, and with the backdrops of race, class, right, then we start to have these sticky, icky feelings of, well, who gains from these arrangements? And so I'm trying to have, I'm trying to invite you who are in this Koji community to start to think about these practice-based questions that kind of lend themselves to very political questions of then who stands to gain, right? Who has the privilege of gaining from these capitalist arrangements? And so you might be wondering, well, why now? Well, part of it is because this community, this KojiCon community, has had, I think, enough time to establish itself, right? It's had enough of a following. We only need to look at the hashtag Koji Builds Community to see the sort of span and the reach, but also because it's been enough time to see now the lineage of Koji knowledge transfer from one person to another. And I'll give you one example. For instance, some of you may know this person who goes by the name Nakaji. And he wrote this book, which some of you may even have or have consulted. And then this person, right? Haruko Uchishiba, who is based in London, who then credits her Koji knowledge to Nakaji, right? And is very open about that on the internet, right? On their website. And then we see the knowledge transfer further through practice, but also through spores to this person, a chef by the name of Sam Black. And now this person is going onto Patreon to then offer Koji lessons elsewhere. Now, there is absolutely no shade, to be clear, zero shade on people like Sam Black. And if you're in the audience, hello. No shade whatsoever, because this isn't necessarily or inherently an extractive setup, right? But it does raise the question of who stands to benefit and how and what kinds of relationships do these lineages offer? Because on the one hand, yes, knowledge is being transferred in an embodied way through practice from one person to another. There's also the promotion, right, of knowledge beyond one particular place to different countries and then to different audiences, right? And this is all very important to do. But again, I think it's time to start reflecting on what other relationships and what kind of reciprocal relations can be cultivated in a community like this one, right? And it's not enough for me to point out this, right, from the outside. I'm asking you as a community to internally ask yourselves and reflect on this now. So if you're not convinced why this is worth pursuing, I'm going to offer 2 reasons why it might be worth pursuing now in particular. And one has to do with terminology, right? The term Koji is actually quite ambiguous and covers quite a far ground. It's also a very flexible term, right? We know, for instance, that at least in a Japanese context, Koji often becomes synonymous with Aspergillus oryzae when that is not necessarily true. Koji can mean any one of the aspergilluses, for instance. Aspergillus oryzae is used in particularly sake and miso settings, and the Aspergillus soya is used more for shoyu brewing, and the latter two are used more for shochu brewing, right? But within the whole world of fungal ferments, right, and that's what encompasses or what is encircled, right, on the slide right now, within the whole world of fungal ferments, the words and the terminology kind of start to shift, because we know that, for instance, what's in the smaller circle refers to a Japanese cultural context, right? And it kind of stomps out other instances such as the Korean meju or nuruk, or even the Chinese chu, or even what Lily Wen was talking about last week, right? With the rukai use of fungal ferments. I think she called it ika. So here we have this, the risk of having this oversimplified, well, Koji equals Aspergillus oryzae equals Japan, which doesn't really encompass all of its praxis, right? If we think of fungal ferments writ large, there's so much more to offer, and I think we can stand to be a bit more nuanced, right? And the threat of not paying attention to this terminology means that, for instance, this practices that Lily is doing out in Rukai food culture kind of threatens to be extinct, right, and stomped out. And so when we have instances or examples like nuruk, right, which actually crosses more than just Aspergillus oryzae and into other types of species, then we really need to be a bit more specific and context specific about what we mean by Koji ferments, right? So that's one instance. And then another reason that we perhaps ought to think about, well, who benefits from Koji, is that there are different groups who are making it and different groups who are promoting it. And while Koji is very flexible, it also relies on particular infrastructures and a particular documentation. So what do I mean by that? Infrastructure, I mean by like physical places, right? And physical ways, materials, tools to make Koji happen. So this might be a laboratory, it might be a house kitchen, it might be a restaurant kitchen, it might be the trays that you make them in, whether they're stainless steel or wood, right? But infrastructure also includes the texts, the books, the visuals, the ways that, that knowledge gets passed down from one person to another, right? And documentation, what I mean by that is also the videos, the photographs, the texts that describe how Koji is made, and then how that documentation spreads globally. So one way to think about the flexibility of Koji, I'm going to use an XY axis, so bear with me here. It's a bit abstract, but I promise you it'll be worth it. On one axis, let's imagine the flexibility of who gets to make Koji. On the one hand, you have individuals, who make it at a very small scale. It might be at the scale of a household, right? Nakaji is doing this work around like 100 grams at a time Koji, right? Versus at perhaps a restaurant scale, right? Very different infrastructures come into play here. We can also think about a y-axis of, where is the Koji being made, right? And we can think about East Asian climate and culture, which tends to be humid, right? Very conducive to fungal ferments. And we could think about the practices that are outside of an East Asian culture and an East Asian climate. And then what are the adaptations that people have had to make as a result? And so when we look at these examples, then we can start to kind of plot out, well, where are these instances of Koji happening? And we can see that they're actually quite far-reaching and spread out, right? We can maybe put Jeremy Umansky's, example here, and we might put the bettarazake and the sagohachizake over here, right? And we can kind of start to see, okay, well, here's where action's happening, and here's where maybe some things aren't happening, right? And then one other thing, though, that this XY coordinate may not take into account is the political question of how is this Koji knowledge being transmitted, right? You can learn through books, limited, I would argue, and you can learn through people. And the thing with books and people is that books make a profit and some people can make a profit, but not every book and not every person. And so here are the ways that maybe we can start to nuance, well, how exactly is this Koji knowledge being transferred? Because on the one hand, this flexibility of Koji makes it seem as though anyone can access Koji, right? But, well, there are language differences. There's certainly financial accommodations or financial access of being able to travel, having the wherewithal to spend time going into different communities in East Asia to be able to visit for long enough, right, to be able to embody this praxis over time, whether that's through an internship or an apprenticeship, or whether that is through, a chance encounter, right? Like you have to have already some ways, some have, the access already. You have to have the wherewithal to be able to get into Koji knowledge and get it somehow and embody it. So then here we have, these questions of, well, how did this community come to be, right? Again, this Koji, this particular hashtag is great and wonderful. And it's great to see people coalesce around Koji. But this is one of many Koji communities that are out there. And that Koji built this particular community. And so I'm curious what you as a community will do after this. And who else will you involve? And what other relations are you going to be creating, right? And beyond just online, right? Sure, KojiCon, like right now, is one way of maintaining ties. Slack is another community to do that. But what other ways? How else are you going to meet each other? How else are you going to learn from each other? And how else are you going to keep promoting and broadening and perhaps nuancing what it means to build communities through Koji praxis? And so with this in mind, right, because I'm not just here to like call out the critique and shake my finger, I do want to offer two ways of thinking about what the future of Koji communities might entail. One way to think about it is through a vertical lineage model, something like a kinship model. And there are groups who do this, right, already. So for instance, this might sound like a far-flung example, but I promise you it's worthwhile. Think about how ballroom culture and I mean specifically queer underground ballroom culture, like voguing, right? They have a very clear setup around vertical lineage kinship models, where the people who you learn from are in literal houses, right? The house of ninja, the house of extravaganza. These are different houses with different mothers and different fathers, and that the way and the styles and the tactics that each house uses is very clear from the start who you learned from, what you have inherited from the people before you, and then what you offer to the next generation. Very clear along the lines, right? And so on the one hand, and you might be wondering, well, why establish that sort of vertical hierarchy? Ooh, that might be a bit weird. Well, it makes sense for a queer community in the sense that for many, this was chosen family, right? And so there was a power in being seen and being embraced and being accepted in these communities as part of a queer chosen family, right? And so on the one hand, the pros of having this sort of lineage model, this vertical model, is that you have very explicit leading and very explicit following and very explicit inheritance from one generation to the next. And as a result, the infrastructure is very much there because you're inheriting the infrastructure from before, right? Now, the con for all of this is that you kind of have to be let in. And so gaining entry from the outside might not be as simple. Now, in contrast, there's a commons model, which one might think of as being more horizontal, right? And one very simple example of that might be Wikipedia. Wikipedia is an example of a knowledge commons. It's common to all people. It is understood as a public good, a common good, right? And that anybody can make an entry in Wikipedia and anybody can edit any entry in Wikipedia. So on the one hand, really great, anybody can enter and anybody contribute, and it's good for documenting practices over time. On the other hand, infrastructure is really hard to maintain. And if you have ever visited Wikipedia around Thanksgiving time, you might have met with a banner, you might have seen a banner like this that is asking for money to be able to continue and persist, right? And so here we can, if we were to apply it to this particular Koji community, might be wondering, well, how does one continue KojiCon over time, right? Over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15, 25, right? What will be the infrastructure that you lay down now so that you can persist and build and maintain and be resilient over time? So I mentioned these two, one vertical, one horizontal way of understanding communities because they're a bit of a caricature. I admit that. And I'm not trying to present it as either or. Might draw a little bit from column A and you might draw a little bit from column B. But what matters is that you as a community need to perhaps think about this now and precisely think about what kinds of relationships do you want to build within this community. Because this, I would hope this community to be built on relations of trust and relations of reciprocity. That is what I hope for. Because, as I said, Koji offers a world of possibilities, but it also offers a world of political questions, right? Around who is allowed to enter, who is allowed to make these decisions, who is allowed to promote it, and who gains, right? And perhaps in a more pointed way, I might also add to these two stickier questions of if you are borrowing from a different culture, borrow is not the same as take. What are you borrowing from and what do you intend to give back and when? Or if you are learning just the tool of how to use Koji, well then what is the cost of that, right? Because tools come at a cost. If I were to buy a microscope, that's thousands of dollars. So if Koji is a tool, what is the cost of that? It might be monetary, it might not be. But again, these are the types of questions that lead to what kinds of relationships do you want to cultivate over time, right? And especially in the context of colonial, imperial, misogynistic, and racist histories, not just within East Asia, but also globally. Not attending to these questions will only lead to more problems down the future. So again, I implore you to start thinking about this now in the sense that, well, if KojiCon is a convention, right? That's what cons are, right? Koji Con, Koji Convention. Then maybe it's time to think about representatives and delegates and who gets to come to these delegates and who gets to have a say. And maybe that's something that KojiCon or this particular community doesn't want. That I don't know that. That's for you all to decide. And I think it's high time you start to think about it. And so in a previous talk elsewhere, I had talked about culture. In this case, I was talking about Japanese food culture or East Asian food culture. I made a comment around how culture is not just a thing, it's not just an object, and it's not just a noun, and how it's a verb, right? To culture something is to actively cultivate it. I would also maybe say that community is also a verb. And who do you commune with? How, when, how often, and what are the terms of engagement, right? And here I am echoing the work of actually disability scholar and disability activist Gabrielle Peters, who's based out in BC, Canada, who says that community is a verb, not just a noun. It's the act of doing, it's being present. And I think that here is a way that we are tying back into the themes of presence, place, and possibility, right? But again, think of who is allowed to be present, in what ways, who is allowed to occupy a space, and who is allowed to take advantage of possibilities, and who is credited, and what are the relationships that then come out of the coming together of presence, place, and possibility. So this is a turn of phrase that I often hear in disability communities, but also artist communities who talk about needing to discuss what the politics are by the community, for the community. And so again, I implore you as a community to think about what the future holds, right? And think about what would Koji 2050 look like? Or sorry, KojiCon, right? What would KojiCon 2050 look like? What would that entail? What would it look like? Who would be involved? And what kinds of conversations do you want to be having? And so as one of many Koji communities, it may be worth reflecting on who and how you want to conduct yourselves now for the future, and how you might steer yourselves towards building trust and reciprocity. And speaking of trust and reciprocity, I will guide you to or suggest potential readings for those of you who might be interested in this topic. The first is The Art of Gathering, written by Priya Parker, and a really good example of the sort of conceptual backbone of what it means to convene. And Priya goes through all sorts of examples, from weddings to funerals to dinner parties, but the why it matters is really what ties all of the chapters through. And even if you're just standing at a bookstore and thumb through it, I think you will gain so much of what it means to host and host well, and not just in a hospitality sense, but what does it mean to really generate these relationships that are built on trust, right? And maybe even enjoyment. The second thing I will recommend is a piece written by Jessica Johns, who's an Indigenous scholar and writer based in Canada, or the place named Canada. And R is for Reciprocity is a very short piece around what does it mean to have reciprocal relations, not just amongst people, right? For instance, between Indigenous groups and non-Indigenous groups, but also what does it mean to be in reciprocal relations between humans and non-humans. So what does it mean to be in reciprocal relations with kombucha starters, for instance? That's actually one of the examples that she gives. And so I highly recommend that piece as well. And then the last one is a book written by a philosopher named Lisa Helke. And Lisa has written this book, Exotic Appetites, Adventures, Ruminations of a Food Adventurer, back in like 2003, I think, and already starting to think about, well, what does it mean to exoticize these other ethnic cuisines, right? And whether that is Thai or Malay or Japanese or Chinese, but not just East Asia. Those are the examples that I think immediately come to mind that she references early on. But what does it mean to also be the kind of food adventurers. She even calls them food colonizers that sort of parachute in, take food knowledge, out of that community, and then people starting, ethnic cuisine restaurants or so-called ethnic cuisine restaurants on behalf of these other groups, like in food cultures, right, who are not really benefiting from these types of arrangements. And so, though philosophical and though based in philosophy, Lisa Helke is such a good writer that I find anything that she touches is gold. And so it's an earlier work of hers, but still good, called Exotic Appetites. So I know that was a bit of a whirlwind, but again, I think it's high time that this particular community thinks about, what does it mean to be a Koji expert? What does it mean to promote and share that knowledge? And what does it mean to share that knowledge on behalf of who, for whom, right? And to really think about who is part of this community and who wants to, or how do you keep building relationships that are reciprocal and built on trust that then can have that longevity. I'll maybe stop there, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards and the discussion, especially since I know this could be a sore topic, although I will also say, if you're feeling defensive right now, then that might indicate more your own politics of why you feel you need to defend yourself. And that might provide more clues about you than about my talk. That said, I look forward to having more discussions with you right now. Oh, goodness. All sorts of things in the comments. Let's get to it.
Yeah, can you see the comments right now?
I can.
Perfect. Was there any comment that you're like particularly interested in diving into to get started?
I'll maybe just read some of them out loud if that's all right, Eric.
Yeah, sure.
So Julia writes that I also think Koji Con and its community has so far been pretty good about this, especially this year seems more about both other starters and philosophy in some ways than unproblematized Koji. Yeah, absolutely. I think that even between last year and this year, I'm already kind of noticing a turn or a change in phrasing and a change in framing, which is really great. I also think, who is spearheading that? I don't know. I actually don't know. Who is spearheading that? And what are the things in place to make sure that that remains part of the Koji Con community, right? Because one of the things that we see in any kind of group is the change and the turnover in, let's say, institutional knowledge, right? If one person is spearheading that and that person all of a sudden disappears, then what happens to those values, right? What happens to unproblematized Koji? Does that also go away with that person leaving? So again, my question is more structural and infrastructural. It's, what are the measures in place to make sure that Koji remains problematized? That's what I want to know. And if you've already figured it out, great. Keep figuring that out. Let's see. Yeah, thanks, Eleni, for the different axis, XY axis. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one way to think about it. Some might even say it's a bit too nerdy of a way to think about XYZ axis, but I feel like it is a really flexible, complicated thing, and maybe someone somewhere is going to do more research on like who fits where in that XYZ axis. But I don't know, this is actually a question for you all. I cannot think of any ferment, any fungal ferment, let alone, that has this amount of reach and this amount of flexibility. Because bread, maybe, but that's a bit different. And it's taken up and scaled in a way and commoditized in a way that kind of doesn't tap into the same like imperial East-West race class issues as maybe Koji does. And Yeah, I'm curious if there are other examples. And if you can think of other examples that are as flexible and as ambiguous and as problematic as Koji, please write it into the chat, because I, for the life of me, cannot think about it. I am now looking at
I actually had a question sort of like based on the graph that you were just talking about.
yeah.
So you had those three axes. I had it drawn down over here. Um, like wh- who or like what would you see as like being in that center, that like sort of like perfect, like I don't want to say like perfect, but that like I guess perfect midpoint between all three of those axes is like who is that, or like what is that, or what might that look like?
That's a good question. And maybe defining center is not as important as who's on the extremities, because defining who's on the extremities will help you figure out what is all inside that space, right? What is inside that three-dimensional space.
Sure, yeah.
If we put like an auntie making a fungal starter to then make pickles on one end, and like, Noma derivative, oh my God, what's the group that empirical spirits, right? On the other end of that one to many scale. And then let's say the here to there, right? Japan, but not just Japan. I mean, even that becomes a political thing, right? Of like why Japan is the here and not places like Seoul, right? Or Beijing or Taiwan, or, right? So even defining the parameters and the sort of
Yeah.
external parameters is itself a political act. Defining is a political act, and saying this is what it encompasses and this is what it doesn't encompass. So maybe I will offer or flip the question back on you and say, well, it might be worth defining how you see the axes in your particular community or your particular group, right? And maybe one axis isn't enough to figure out the, for instance, the here to there, or even the embodied way, right? I was even thinking about, well, now we have videos, but also what can in videos convey that embodied methods can't, or vice versa, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but I certainly know that when I make Koji, it is so meticulous and so involved, right? Of like, can't overheat it too much. Oh, but gotta keep it at a certain temperature. And it's super hands-on. It's super like curated, a hyper curated environment over time. And there's only so much that a book can describe. There's only so much that a video can describe. And so because of that human component,
Yo.
this is where we come back to, who are you calling in as the expert? Who gets to count as an expert? And then who gets credit as an expert is, I think, worthwhile.
Yeah, that's really like just like this, yeah, that whole like graph is just like a really interesting way to just like think about those like spectrums and like yeah, who, like you were saying, like who is involved in those communities, and like yeah, I like that. And then there's a couple actually yeah, I wanna talk about this comment from Melissa Hoffman. Um So your points about Koji parallel in many ways to the agriculture discipline of permaculture, which is yep, publicly dominated by men, and two, those looking to establish authority to earn a living. I'm curious on that.
Yeah, bros always ruin it. Um, yeah, and it is such, right? This is where we kind of fall back on positions of privilege, right? Who is allowed to be and who is seen as an expert, right? And historically, socially, that has been white cis men, right? And not just white, right? And it's context specific, right? or even not just about agriculture or even fermentation, but even food knowledge, right? We can even go back to the basics of like food knowledge was considered to be a very domestic, relegated to the non-dudes, the non-hunters. And then we look to the profession of cooking and it's all bros, right? I mean, I caricaturize and dramatize for effect here, but it's so much about who gets to claim expertise in these areas. So yeah, Melissa, for sure, there is definitely a promotion of a certain kind of expertise. And I also want to say that it's not just the people who are performing expertise who get to do it, right? It's also the audiences who are listening who are also complicit in this, right? And sort of affirm, yes, you are an expert, and maybe these other people are not. And so I urge also people who are taking in this information to also demand more diverse experts, right? Imagine having the agency to say, hey, we've heard from this one dude for a long time. Maybe we ought to hear what other people have to say. And again, echoing, I forget who said it, but one of the comments was, Koji-Con's getting better about this. Yeah, I agree. Let's continue. Like, yeah, let's keep going in that direction and not just make it a one-off exception or a one-off anomaly, right? Like,
exactly. Yeah.
I mean, that's what I'm hoping for. And I see also in the comments, Ruth asking, well, isn't life all about relationships and all facets? Yeah. And I guess what I'm trying to say is Koji-Con is not an exception. And like ferments are not an exception. It's truly about how do we want to continue building these good relationships, given that there is so much promise and so much hype culturally and economically where only certain people are poised to benefit. And again, no shade on the Sam Blacks out there. No shade. It is a question that I think is better asked proactively and not retroactively.
Yup. I agree. And then I just want to touch a little bit on this comment from Eleni and just like the role of social media as a way. I know you did like the Koji Builds community, but Rich is also starting like Chew Builds community or Newark Builds community. Thoughts on that as like sort of like something positive or something like, I guess, like steps in the right direction?
I think showcasing diversity in the world of fungal ferments is great. I think it's a step in the right direction. I think that there's room for, well, I guess the question is, do you want to keep adding to the list? Or does the community need to or want to diversify? I don't know. That's a question I can't answer. What I will say, though, is this is an Instagram-based community. There are some places in the world where Instagram either cannot be used or is not used. So does the community then continue to coalesce around Instagram only? And that is the sort of cost of entry. Same with Slack, right? Same as having the bandwidth to be able to access Slack and Instagram, right? So again, this isn't a critique of, and therefore you ought to diversify your platforms. It is merely my attempt at showcasing, well, this is one kind of community and understanding what is going to be the next step, right? Are you still going to be an Instagram-based community in 2050? Right. Is that a sustainable way to maintain this relationship amongst the community members? It might be. I don't know. I know for one, like I left, kind of, right? Facebook is a yesteryear thing, right? For some people, right? So again, when it comes to digital platforms, who, what, how, for how long? These are all questions that I think, again, not just this community, this Koji community, but I think many communities online are asking themselves, how do we want to persist over time, right? Yeah.
Thank you. And then there's some like really awesome comments in here. So I want to bring up this one from Caroline. As a fermenter of European descent who learned about Koji from Asian teachers, how do I honor and use their teachings in a less colonizing way? And then this is the follow-up to that comment. I'm working with fermentation as a tool in community building along with cooking. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the first question is to, or the first maybe thing to remember is that there is no one size fits all, because there's not just one kind of relationship to be had, right? But I would say maybe a good place to start is to think about how your teachers view this relationship, and maybe having a conversation with them around, hey, I learned this from you. What can I give back? And they may have very specific things that they want from this relationship, right? And I think even showing a type of humility and ownership around, yeah, I understand my place, I understand my privilege, that I would not be able to do this without your help, right? I think entering into relationship and maintaining those relationships through that sort of humility is a good way to start. And then asking very explicitly, right? And at the very least, I would just credit your source, right? Like, honor your people, even just by name. I think that's already states a lot, right? And I think that it's sort of an unsatisfying answer, Caroline, but I think you kind of have to do your soul searching yourself. And like, what helps you sleep at night? You know, like, what does it mean for you to then honor their teachings in a way, right? And maybe the last thing that one could think about is anything that you are doing keeping the teachers from doing what they already do, right? Because if what you are doing is somehow precluding them or preventing them from continuing to do what they normally do, then that's a problem. That is usurping. I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but I think it's a worthwhile question to imagine and think about, or maybe even reframe what you are doing, right? If you are aiming for the same things or somehow preventing them from doing what they normally and usually and have historically done, then maybe it's time to change how to go about what you are doing.
Sure. Sweet, I like that answer. And then, this was another good one. And this, I think, yeah, like this one, I think, is a very, very important question to be asked. We've often thought here about like, yeah, what is the difference between like appropriation and appreciation, and like where is that line?
Yeah, appropriation is a weird power play. And it's not just food, it's kind of all over. And yeah, I wish culinary schools would do a bit more around that, but also I can't lay it all at the feet of culinary schools. I would also just say, in whatever practice that you are doing, any cultural practice, do your homework. Look into what has already been appropriated and why it's wrong. And that might be clothing. That might be food, right? It might be arts. In terms of fermentation specifically, it's not fungal ferments per se, but for fermentation specifically, there's a really, really, really great article written by Dr. Min Chan. It's in the magazine Eater. It's available online. And the title is something like Fermentation So White. And I'm sure you can figure out from the title what the article is all about. But it is about this exact question of what does it mean to appropriate fermentation practices into a Western, particularly North American context, and to adapt to North American palates, right? And we don't even have to read the article to really even understand the problems and the stakes of that, right? One of my favorite punching bags conceptual punching bags is, oh my God, what's his name? Brad Leone of It's Alive, right? Making kimchi. Oh my goodness. And then a while ago, there was a response video, right, of like two Korean women watch Brad Leone make kimchi, right? Like there's already enough discussion around here about who gets to claim fermentation expertise. And what I'm trying to say is maybe it's time we look at that in the specific Koji context, right? Because it is so finicky. Fungal ferments are finicky AF. And so as a result, you need to have more than just a book to guide you through it. You need people and you need a community to troubleshoot. And as a result, what processes or outcomes or products that then become commodified are representations of potentially appropriation, hopefully not. And so, yeah, this is go back to your question, Ashish. I don't know if it is a borderline so much as or if it is a borderline, I would hope that any person who engages with the fungal ferment understands that the line between appreciation and appropriation is so thin and often exploited that you ought to do your homework.
Sweet. Alrighty. I like that answer as well. Thank you. And then, this is another really good question. Claims like the current extraction, exploitation, appropriation discussion is a rinse and repeat of the history of spices, coffee, chocolate, and more. How do we break that chain? What are your thoughts on that?
Here. Yeah. I mean, and I'll even go one step further, that it's histories of exploitation and extraction from very particular parts of the world, from very particular types of people, right? If we look at coffee, tea, spices, these were all colonial products. These were all part of colonial projects. And so the project of colonialism and the project of capitalism are all about accumulation, resource accumulation, not just the spices and the commodities themselves, but also about human resources and human knowledge, right? And the practices. So yeah, it's an issue. How do you break that chain? That's what you need to figure out as a community. And you need to say, as a community, we stand behind this for these reasons, and we do not stand behind this for these reasons, right? And that can be, I think, it can be as practical as we don't use this kind of rice because it represents histories of chemical, pesticide, synthetic agrochemical usage. And we don't believe in perpetuating that because it represents a much broader project of, let's say, chemical imperialism globally, geopolitically, right? That's one way of practicing that. Another way might be, we define a smaller community around, let's say, Nuruk, and that we don't engage with, other forms of fungal ferments. And that's not to say that the projects are incompatible. It's just around these particular people believe in this and want to prepare or want to cultivate the relationships within the community, right? And just understand that that might not mean everyone else, right? All the grow chefs who parachute in and parachute out. I think there's also a level of like, how do you break the chain? Call it out when you see it. When you see people parachuting in and extracting information and parachuting out, name it, point at it, call it out.
That's the only way it needs, bring awareness to it. And the only way that's going to happen is folks start calling it out.
And I think that there's a way to engage in a conversation with that, right? As opposed to, you've done wrong, we're going to shame you, right? Like cancel culture can only go so far. So I think there are ways to invite people into conversation and dialogue and say, hey, we find this to be an issue and here are the reasons why. Can we find an alternate way to move forward and continue relations with you? And that if there is a no, well, then there's your answer. And if there is a way to break that cycle, then you do it together.
Yeah. Sweet. Then let's see. Oh, this was another pretty interesting comment. Started fermentation decades ago. Needless to say, there's like the Bible approach. She's book Noma fermentation. Nothing before, nothing after, no quotes, no references. Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Again, this is where we community members who practice Koji are also complicit, right? Cite your sources, and because it's not always one Bible. And
Yep.
certainly the Bible, there was something before it, right? And I think, again, do your due diligence, figure out where this information came from, trace that lineage, right? And this goes back to, I think, the comment with Caroline's comment in the chat around like honor where you're like honor the people that you learned from. It's such a simple thing to do. And if you don't know, then maybe find out who that knowledge came from. Right?
Yeah, it never hurts to just ask people questions, see where they got their info from.
Mm-hmm. And if they're not going to give you an answer, that's an answer right there.
Yeah. All right, let's see. I'm scrolling through our. This has been an awesome discussion. I think like a conversation that's like really important to have. So thank you for having this conversation with us. Let's see what is. Talked about that. We touched on all of those.
And maybe, Sarah, I will also echo the frustration, or the frustration that I have is like when people visit Japan for the first time and they're like, oh yeah, it's so great. I learned everything about it. And now I'm going to be like the Japanese ferment, like whatever master. Like, oh yeah, from your one trip. Okay. Good luck with that. Because, nothing came before you. You're the one guy who's going to be the preacher of all Japanese ferments. Good on you.
Good luck with that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then I just saw a comment from Taylor about, I think the article.
Yes,
Lost in the Brine.
Yes.
Sweet. Okay. Awesome. Alrighty, Maya. I think we're looking pretty good on comments and questions. So I think in that case, looks like we can. Let me just pull that off the screen for right now. I think we should be good to wrap up for the morning/afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you so much for also being in this conversation with me, right? Like, I know it's not an easy conversation, and I've tried to make it as palatable as possible, but I'm also going to call it and say it like it is, right? So yeah. Thank you for being a part of this conversation, Eric, and thank you folks in the audience who are really trying to do that reflective work. And I encourage you to continue doing that work amongst yourselves on these, channels like Slack and on through Instagram. I saw also, I think Eleni was mentioning that there's an ambassadors program. Like, really start to think about what does it mean to have a sense of community, because community is also about belonging, right? So there's tremendous amount of power in that. There's tremendous amount of opportunity to really steer this community in a very intentional way. Take advantage of it, right? Like, make it happen. Like, do that reflexive work, right? Don't capitulate the same things that we see. I've already seen like, rich isn't Rezepi. Yeah, that's great. Now continue with it, right? Yeah. Like, go beyond rich, and so anyway, thank you again. I know we're at time. And so Eric, I'll hand things off to you.
Great. I just want to show a few comments just to show the appreciation for this discussion. Great as always, and just really important things that need to be talked about. So thank you for bringing these up today.
Yeah, of course.
Alrighty. With that, Maya, I'll remove you from the stream, and then we'll wrap up our morning session.
Sounds good.
Alrighty, folks. So yeah, very interesting conversation, discussion. Yeah, one that like needs to happen and needs to continue happening. Food is all about like the people who are involved in it, so making sure that things are reciprocal is very important. So yeah, keep having those conversations as well in our Slack channel, online, and whatever way that you can have those conversations in your life. So to end our session today, you can check out some of Maya's work on her website at heymayahay.com. Fantastic name. And if you want to, you can also check her out on Instagram at heymayahay. If you want to learn more about the Yellow Farmhouse and what we're doing over here, feel free to check out our website at yellowfarmhouse.org. And you can also find us on Instagram at yellowfarmct. If you have any questions about the conference so far, feel free to shoot us an email at info@yellowfarmhouse. And if you aren't already, be sure to follow KojiCon on Instagram at koji.con. We have 3 more presentations coming up today. So at 10 a.m., we're going to be joined by Rojamar Alvarado Garcia. At 1 p.m., we're going to be joined by Jeremy Umansky. And at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we're going to be joined by Nobu Owiki. So be sure to tune in for those sessions later today. And with that, I'll sign off and I shall see y'all later.